Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm a lecturer in early childhood studies at Bath Spa University and an associate lecturer at the Open University. I'm a trustee for the Fatherhood Institute and also an independent writer and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be exploring representation in the early years, inspiring you with guidance on ways to be more inclusive in your practice. And I'm delighted to introduce Laura Henry-Allain MBE as today's guest. To round up our fourth and final episode, I thought it would be interesting to take the conversation further than the setting to discuss supporting and empowering every family. So Laura, how important is family diversity in today's society? How do you recognise the uniqueness and diversity of every family?
I think it is so important that every family feels that they are included within society as a whole, and their family is acknowledged irrespective of how diverse they are. And I think we do need to come away from this, which I think we are slowly but surely, mum, dad and two children element. And I think that's quite dangerous. It's about talking to families and asking them how they wish to be addressed, who's in their family, how we have that level of professional curiosity as educators and teachers, and doing that leaning in and listening and knowing how unique every family is.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, diverse families have always existed, but it's just our understanding and representation of them that we still have a long way to go with. I mean, what's your sense in terms of your career looking back on how much that acknowledgement of diverse families has changed in recent times?
Oh my goodness me, it has changed heaps and bounds. And I think if I'm talking about it from a personal point of view, because I think it is important when, as educators, that when we are sharing, where possible, where people feel comfortable enough to do so, my own lived experience. So my parents were divorced, and growing up as a child in school, I always felt shamed because my parents were divorced. And I never wanted to say that my parents were divorced. And guess what? All the imagery that one saw in books, on the television, mum and dad and two children. And I'm one of six, so we didn't fit that norm as well. And so my mum raised us by herself. And I always felt this, odd one out when people were talking about their families, the jobs that their dad did. And, I knew, obviously, because my parents were divorced, I knew the job that my dad worked as, but he didn't live with us. So I always felt that sense of not being included in conversations. And I don't want to get emotional about it. So that's what I think in terms of me now. I'm in a really good position to talk about it and to share stories in my work, training and consultancy, and writing children's books where children can see themselves and where children can see, well, it's okay that my mum or dad, they're raising me by themselves. It's okay that I live with my grandmother. It's okay that my older sister, who's 20, is looking after me. It's okay that I've got two mums or two dads, and my mum died when I was 3. And I can have a conversation about it, and I can see within books and within materials and when I put on the TV that different families exist that mirror my family,
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that story, Laura. I think a lot of listeners will be able to resonate with that. On a practical level then, what can practitioners do when working with families who are diverse, who are not, the simple mum and dad children kind of nuclear makeup? How can they support them in practice on a daily basis so that the child doesn't grow up with those feelings of shame, perhaps, or things like that?
Yeah, I think it's really important that settings and schools cross-reference their policies and procedures. Because up until about, I think it was just before lockdown, I was in a setting or a school, and I was just looking at a form, and it had to state mum and dad, and I was just mortified. Mm. And obviously I had to have a gentle chat and to say, well, actually, there are so many children that don't fall into having a mum and a dad. And again, once I explained it, then straight away, you know, they came to me half an hour and they said, look, we've changed the form now, Laura. And I just thought, you know, that's an action there. So it's, again, doing those audits, what you have in terms of your literature, what you're sharing with parents, how does that come across? How we do those celebrations. And that's why 6 years ago I created My Family Week, because I was just sort of like so fed up with the commercialization of Mother's Day and Father's Day, and thinking so many children don't fit into this. Mm. And to the point when I created that, I got an email, which I was searching for this morning, actually, for something that I'm writing, from an orphanage in Mexico. And the head of this orphanage said to me, thank you for creating My Family Week, because a lot of our children have a lot of anger around Mother's Day when the time comes along. So having this week now, My Family Week, where we can celebrate differences in family, will really empower them. You know, it's not going to take it away from their trauma. I'm not saying that it's about sweeping children's trauma, anxiety under the carpet, but it's about giving children that voice to say, this is my family, and my family is recognised within society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that raises or gets me thinking about the kind of myths or stereotypes that we have about diverse family structures. There's often this myth about the absent dad, isn't there? And children not developing as well because there's a father figure missing. You know, and the myth of the single parent, you know, that ideal, that norm that you need two parents in your family for the child to develop in a better way. But actually, we know that those diverse family forms do a lot better, or they do exactly the same, you know, than any other family. So it's those myths that practitioners need to be aware of and perhaps challenge when we're thinking about diverse family structures. But I want to ask you about your forthcoming book, because resources can also be, you know, really, really important. And I know that you've got My Family, Your Family coming up, being released, maybe released at the time this podcast is launched. So that should be available. We'll link that below. Perhaps you could share a bit of insight into how that book came about and what it's about and how it can be used in settings with children.
I think equally similarly with My Skin, Your Skin, My Family was an extension of what I started 7 years ago, My Family Week, and including in that the diversity of families, what I mentioned previously, 2 mums, 2 dads, but, you know, step, half, the different terminologies. I mentioned surrogacy. I also too mention blended families, donorship, all of those types of families, which are the norm for many children that are going to be within our settings. Yes, it's a book to be used, which is age, stage and ability appropriate. Yes, it is a book that I would say would need a grown-up to support a child with it. Like My Skin, Your Skin, I will be writing some resources to support educators and teachers and parents on how to use the book. I talk about different homes, because not every child lives in a house. Some children live in a boat. Some children, unfortunately, live in a hotel through no circumstances of their own. So we must talk about that as well. I've made reference to the Gypsy, Roma and travelling community, because I've talked about some children live in a caravan. When I've talked about celebrations, I've included a horse fair, because there is the horse fair that some of the Gypsy, Roma and travelling community attend. So that was quite important for me. And visually, I love the way the illustrator, Giovanni, has actually done a really good job in terms of the diversity. There's all of the characters have different shapes, which I love, different headwear. We see disability. And I make a point in the book that sometimes our families can make us laugh, but keeping it real, sometimes our families can make us sad. And then there's a point in there that making sure if children are reading the book and there is a trigger, I say that, you know, if you are feeling sad and you want to talk about your family, make sure to speak to a trusted grown-up, like your special grown-up. And I've tried to come away from using that term parent or mum and dad. I've said a grown-up because some children do live with that kinship arrangement. So that's why, again, for the listeners listening to this, language is super important. And for some children that don't have that mum and dad there in their lives, biologically, yes, every child does have that mum and dad, but then maybe not so who they are currently living with. So, for instance, children who are fostered, who are adopted, etc., surrogacy. So language for me is very important, and asking those questions. How do parents want to be referred to? So when they register for your school and setting, we're not making those assumptions. And one of the things my sister-in-law said to me years ago when her son, who was actually 25 a couple of days ago, when he was in nursery, she obviously knew the job that I was in early years. She said in his nursery, when she went to collect him, dropping him off in the morning, it was consistently, I'm going to change the name, it was consistently, Jeffrey's mum, Jeffrey's mummy, Jeffrey's mummy. And none of them ever said her name. So as an action point for, and I know again, some of you probably do this, we should know the names of our parents in our settings. How do they wish to be addressed? And that's the starting point, because not everybody wants to be called, Laura or Miss Henry, Mrs. Henry. Ask parents, how do they want to be addressed without making that assumption and that overgeneralization. And my sister-in-law felt it was very patronizing. And that then, to me, when we're talking about that if we bring in here that key person approach and building relationships with the child and their special grown-up, what do we know about their special grown-up? How do they want to be addressed? Because that's very important. And I know when I call the bank, they always say to you, don't they, do you mind if I call you Laura? And I say, yes, that's fine. I don't mind being called Laura, but some people want to be addressed by their full title, and we have to respect that. So when we're talking about diversity in family, it comes back to how we respect those families and how we do the listening in and leaning in within that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to that book, though, I think it's fantastic to hear that Gypsy Roma traveller families are represented in that. They're obviously quite a heavily persecuted group in society and very rarely represented in early childhood contexts. So it's fascinating, brilliant that's included within there.
And thank you for mentioning that, because when I said, earlier on in the different episodes, I'm still learning. Mm-hmm. So for the last, I would say 8 years, that has been the community that I've been listening and leaning into. And Lisa Smith, who works for the Traveller Times, I met her at a global conference, not even in the UK, it was in New Zealand, but she's based in the UK, and I connected with her. And again, tell me your story. Just start with that. What's your story? And then I just said, wow, this is just amazing work that you do. And I was brought up in West London, and there is a travellers site there under the Westway. And some children from that community I went to school with. So I've been brought up with the Gypsy community, but not much so the travellers and the Roma community. So I interviewed Lisa for a podcast. There's another person for the Roma community called Nikki Hughes. When I interviewed her for a podcast, I was crying hearing her story, because as well as you saying being persecuted, she's got a child with a disability, and the stories that you hear, and people just get away with it. You know, I belong to a Facebook group, a local one, and somebody posted a car throwing out rubbish, and straight away one of the comments was, I bet you that was a gypsy. And then I was like, but how do you know that? So again, it's just, and Lisa Smith, I am having a conference book launch, and Lisa's coming along to speak at that. So again, when we are talking about bringing in other voices, how are we bringing others from, especially the Gypsy, Roma and travelling community, to share their stories, because their stories matter to what we do within early childhood education.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you're creating space for that. I do really think that Gypsy, Roma, traveller families are very rarely spoken about at all in early childhood context. So it's great that they're having some visibility at your conference and in this book as well. I guess that speaks more broadly to the responsibility of the setting towards the community, doesn't it? And settings don't work in kind of isolated silos. They have a real sense of power and responsibility to work with families and the wider community. Because racism doesn't just happen between children in the nursery, for instance. It happens in the community, and those incidents filter into the nursery and vice versa. So what would your advice be really for practitioners and settings wanting to go out and do that work with the wider community in terms of promoting family diversity, promoting equality and inclusion? How can they reach out to the communities and better bring them in, listen to their voices and create those meaningful connections?
Yeah, I think firstly it's to acknowledge, I know that settings and schools are currently under a lot of pressure with budgets and recruitment. So, you know, when we share things that may be useful, I don't want settings and schools to feel overwhelmed. Oh, another thing we have to do. So I think it's about maybe pressing that pause button and having reflections back to your values and your mission, etc., and your ethos, and start small. So maybe next door to your setting, you may have a community centre, you may have a place of worship like a mosque, a church or a temple, and start those small links. You may even have a parent or a member of staff that's got a family member or a friend that's got an interesting job that they can come in to talk to children and to staff. So it's about thinking creativity, being creative within being solution driven, but not overwhelming yourself. So start with maybe a small thing. What's on your doorstep? What can you do? How can you connect with others to have that community approach within that, and your schools as well. So schools and nurseries working together, nurseries and schools, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really important. And I think you're right to say that we don't want to burden practitioners with more work, but you know, at the same time, this is fundamental. If there's one thing you have to do, it really should be that equality and inclusion, as well as the other things. We know how busy it can be within the practitioner's day to think about these sorts of things, but they are fundamental, and creating that space is of course really, really important. We're just coming to the end of this podcast now, Laura, so I might just give you some space to really reflect on the state of equality and inclusion in early childhood. If you were Prime Minister for a day, what sort of change would you want to see? What change would you make for children and families to better enhance their experiences in the early years?
I love that question. I think if I were Prime Minister, if I ruled the world, I think what I would do, I would start with, and everything that we talk about, Shaddai, I know you're speaking to some other fantastic colleagues in this series who are both inspiring, all inspiring. It comes down to finance. It's a financial investment. So I would have a minister for childhood equality and inclusion. So that's it. That's what we would start with, a minister, and that would be their special role. But we would need to start with a budget with that, and how that government department, how they work closely with local authorities, how they work closely with the voluntary sector, because sometimes I find when there's an incentive that's rolled out nationally, it's given to one particular group and it's a one size fits all. But when we're talking about inclusion and diversity and race, it doesn't work that way, because every single community is different. Every single community is different. Every child and family is different. Every setting and school is different. So I think the money needs to be localized and it needs to be impactful. So that's what I would start with. I think we need to have financial resources to make those changes. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be included within initial qualifications. It needs to be included within continuing personal and professional development, job descriptions, everything from recruitment. And it's not just that. When I was inspecting, one of the requirements would be, you've got a black doll, you've got a wheelchair. Mm. And I kid you not, one local authority, childminders used to pass the black doll around because they hadn't advance notice. And that, to me, it's what we're talking about. It's more than the resources and the materials. It comes from the educators and teachers, the hearts and the minds. So intellectually, you can be thinking about it, but what changes are we making to the heart? So it's a manifesto that I would have. Laura for Prime Minister.
The Minister.
I would never do it. I would never do it, by the way, listeners. I'd never get involved in politics, that side of it.
Yeah, Minister for Childhood. It's interesting, actually. We had Professor Gina Rippon on to talk about gender equality a couple of episodes ago, and she actually said a similar thing. She would have a Minister for gender equality that would focus on childhood. And that really links into kind of broader issues around pay and conditions for staff, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's the pay and conditions, and that comes back to the finances and that government investment within the real government investment that makes that impact, where we don't have settings struggling, you know what I mean, to pay salaries, to keeping themselves afloat. But we live in hope, don't we?
We do. We live in hope. But as long as we're talking, as long as we're listening, as long as we're building those communities of hope, we're doing the work at a small level and hoping for that bigger change over a longer time. I think that's a brilliant space and place to end that conversation. Thank you so much for being today's guest, Laura.
No, thank you. Thank you, Shaddai. No, I enjoyed it, actually. Thank you very much. Thank you to TTS as well for providing this space for this conversation. And thank you. And thank you, listeners. Anybody wants to get in contact with me, I am on the socials. Thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Laura, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Laura Henry-Allain MBE. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.